Welcome to That Jewish News Show. I'm Laura E. Adkins, the Forward's opinion editor.
And I'm Benyamin Cohen, the Forward's news director.
Happy first day of Pride Month, first day of June. It's feeling like summer. If you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube Live, please say hi and where you're listening from in the comments. We love seeing where all y'all are joining from. Up ahead, we're going to be joined by a colleague. What are we talking about this week, Benjamin?
We are going to be joined. I've been looking forward to this conversation. We're going to be joined by our colleague, Mira Fox. She's a culture reporter here at The Forward. And she's been writing a series of interesting stories about how religious groups, both Jewish and Christian, have decided to get their messages out in what I consider a really old-fashioned way, which is through billboard advertising. So she'll be joining us in a few minutes to talk about that. So looking forward to that. But first, Laura, how was your Memorial Day weekend? Did you do anything special?
I did. I don't know about special, but definitely fun. It was gorgeous weather here in New York. I went on a really nice hike up near Breakneck Ridge. I had an amazing time both hiking by myself, which I love, but also just seeing all of the, I would say, non-traditional hiking groups that were out on the mountain for Memorial Day weekend. My favorite was there was this big group of, I think, two different families, two different Russian-speaking families. And as I was coming down the mountain, they were coming up, and not half a mile into the course, the two dads were having a smoke break on the side of the mountain. It's like that's a way to do it. It's also the start of rooftop bar season here in New York City. All of them are absurdly overpriced. Save your money, go somewhere else. But what were you up to, Benjamin?
Does the drink taste better on a rooftop bar?
It just the one adjective I would describe these places as is sticky, which is not exactly like the vibe I'm into. It
Yeah.
was, I think, Fleet Week. There were a lot of naval
Oh.
officers on the roof. So if that's your thing, you missed it. But
Next
no, I
year.
mean, we live in a great city with amazing views. So if you can get to a high up place elevation wise
Right.
around the city, it's a good time. But I would maybe recommend a mountain on the Hudson over a rooftop bar, but whatever
No.
floats your boat. Yeah. Were you
Uh,
outdoorsy this weekend, Benjamin?
no, I prefer air conditioning. I,
That's
I
fair.
I was inside. I spent my Memorial Day weekend vegging in front of the TV and binge watching Indian matchmaking.
Nice.
And we a few weeks ago we interviewed Eliza Ben Shalom, who's the star of Jewish Matchmaking, which is
Right.
from the same company, the same producers. Both are on Netflix. I don't know. I maybe it's heretical for me to say this, but I enjoyed Indian matchmaking more than Jewish matchmaking.
Mhm.
Maybe because I'm an outsider and I could
Right.
appreciate it like as from an outsider point of view. I also thought the singles on the Indian matchmaking show were, I don't know, they seemed a little more marriage minded and serious than some of than some of the Jewish singles that we saw on that Netflix
Interesting.
series. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most Jewish Americans are much more American than traditionally Jewish in their behaviors and
Right.
attitudes. If you look at, every study of Jewish Americans, like we're overwhelmingly secular and like looking like a regular American. So I also felt I haven't seen Indian matchmaking, but I did feel that some of the Jewish angles were a bit contrived in the Jewish matchmaking show, but
Yeah.
that sounds fun. Have you seen comedian Zarna Garg's Netflix, or not Netflix, Amazon
Amazon.
special yet?
No, it's so funny you bring that up. I heard an interview with her on a different Jewish podcast, which I shall not name. Uh, but she was hilarious, I heard that she had a special coming on Amazon. Is it good?
It's really good. I mean, I'm a little biased. I met Zarna at the Comedy
And
Cellar.
she's an Indian comedian for our
She's
listeners
an
who are not.
Indian
Yeah.
comedian. Yes, she is awesome. She's like this stay-at-home mom who decided to get into comedy, and she's hilarious. I met her at the Comedy Cellar like a year ago probably. And she was pretty established, but so knowing someone personally always makes me more
Right.
invested in their success. But I thought it was hilarious. I need to reach out to her and tell her. But if you're looking for like a lighthearted, it's also nice when so much of comedy today is like pretty raunchy, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, but she manages to be hilarious and not crass, which I think is very cool. So I think it's on Amazon Prime. Can't remember the title, but we'll put it in the show notes for you.
Yeah. Um, so what else was happening this week? It was the start of the trial in Pittsburgh of
Hmm.
the Tree of Life. The accused shooter in the Tree of Life shooting finally began this week. They had jury selection for several weeks, and they finally chose a jury at the end of last week, and they started the trial this week.
Yeah.
And witnesses took the stand. The rabbi took the stand. They had the 911 one of the 911 operators took the
Wow.
stand, and they were playing that 911 tape. From what I heard, and our colleagues at the Jewish Telegraphic Agency were in the courtroom, and they reported some really good details, which are up on our site. Just how emotional it was for the
Yeah.
witnesses. People were crying. I mean, it's a traumatic event, and it's been 2018, so it's been almost 5 years, 4.5 years, and it's still such a raw.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's
So.
wild. I mean, I have a good friend who is a reporter for the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, and just I mean, there's something about this prolonged, protracted trauma
Hmm.
and, being forced. I mean, they talk about this a lot with, victims of sexual assault who have to go on the stand over and over, and every time a parole hearing comes up for the perpetrator of the crime against them. Like it is really continuously, I don't even want to say re-traumatizing, but continuously traumatizing for a community to like live all of this in detail. So our
Yeah.
thoughts are with our friends in Pittsburgh, and we'll certainly be covering it on the site
Yeah.
as well.
I may try to make it to the. I was looking this before we hopped onto the podcast this morning. I was looking at the courthouse website. I may try to go next week,
Yeah.
and be in the courtroom. So
Yeah.
we'll see what happens with that. So the big news also overnight was the debt ceiling. And here at
Right.
the Forward, we always try to find Jewish angles. Laura, did we find a Jewish angle
We
to the debt
found
ceiling?
a Jewish angle.
Yeah.
So last night, as you mentioned, the House finally passed a package that will raise the debt ceiling and forestall a default until at least 2025. It was the result of a messy compromise between Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Joe Biden. And Rabbi Brad Hirschfeld wrote a piece for us that argues this sort of compromise where neither side is perfectly happy, but the problem ends up being solved, is actually the Talmudic ideal of justice. It's a really interesting argument, this idea that it's not necessarily about a perfect solution, but about one that both sides have worked toward. That is the
Hmm.
ideal.
Compromise.
It's an interesting argument,
Yeah.
and when I was looking for related stories to this, I just was checking what we'd written about the debt ceiling, others that we've been almost in crisis, and I was reminded of 10 years ago. Do you remember this wonky solution that was proposed? Rep. Jerry Nadler, who's still in Congress, proposed minting a $1 trillion coin to solve the debt ceiling crisis. It was endorsed by none other than economist Paul Krugman in the New York
Wow.
Times. It was this weird legal loophole that allows the Treasury to mint platinum coins in any denomination. It was made to make more like these celebratory commemorative coins and stuff, but
Hmm.
technically they could have minted this coin. Obviously, that's not what happened in 2013, but it was very funny, other solutions that had been proposed. This one seems a little bit better for the country.
Your coins seem to be so, like, I don't know, if it was a 1 trillion, I would expect it to maybe be a bill instead of a coin or something.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that the treasury itself, like, there was some loophole where, the anything but these commemorative coins are controlled by a different. I'm not an expert. I'm sure someone will write a nice email to us reminding us how the Fed and the treasury work and all their various responsibilities, but in conclusion, money is fake, and that's it.
And we got one more news story before we bring on Mira to join us to talk about Jewish and Christian billboards. This story caught my eye a couple days ago. Peruvian police confiscated 58 bricks of cocaine covered in Nazi flags and Hitler's name on a ship headed for Belgium. And we did a little more research.
Yes, when I think trying to hide when I think trying to hide my illicit drugs, I think of very nondescript symbols like swastikas and Hail Hitlers. That really seems like a great move.
There's a reason though. I was reading the article because it turns out traffickers they often when they want to label their drugs with strange logos and other designs to kind of make it distinguish it from other products, so it's like, oh, that's
Mhm.
that type of cocaine, or that, that's that brand of cocaine. I mean,
Yeah.
they were also giving other examples. They found cocaine stamped with the YouTube logo. They found cocaine with logos of Tesla and Prada. I don't know, what logo would you put on cocaine if you were making cocaine?
Oh my gosh, this is a question so far removed from my everyday life, obviously. I don't know, isn't there some nickname for cocaine that has to do with an angel or something? Maybe like
Yeah.
a snow angel, or I know that like going skiing is sometimes a euphemism. Yeah, maybe like a skiing snow angel or something. That feels kind of fun. Get some What logo would you put, Benjamin?
I don't know.
Maybe one of our
So,
competitors' logos. That would be a nice move.
but maybe this is a good segue to our guest today, Mira, because maybe you could put Jewish organizations could put their logos on cocaine.
It's an absurd start.
Maybe. Yeah, that's what an intro. Although I do have to say angel dust is PCP, not cocaine.
Okay. I'm not up on my
Gotta keep
drugs lingo.
your street names straight. But
Well,
yeah, Jewish
le-
orgs are putting their brand on billboards to try to take your segue there. Yeah, I got this idea for the story because I live between Providence and New York, and so we drive back and forth along I-95 all the time. And there's these kind of ubiquitous Christian billboards that are all over the place that say, where are you going, heaven or hell? Are you ready to meet God, the Holy Bible, the truth, etc. And because I'd previously done some reporting on Jew Belong, which has been doing for the past couple years these like magenta, hot pink campaigns against anti-Semitism all over New York on bus stands, etc. It sort of made me think about the fact that they are certainly not the first religious group to put up billboards. And in fact, like most people have seen in their lives many Christian billboards because they are just absolutely everywhere. But there's like I think to basically all billboards, there's sort of this low budget feel where you're driving by like, ads for Cracker Barrel alongside the ad for Jesus. And you're just like, can this possibly work? Any of them, really. Like, as I said in the piece, I also drive by all of these ads for hospital centers advertising like hip surgery. And I'm like, who is choosing their hip surgery off of a billboard? Like, I just don't. So I just thought it would be an interesting in to see like whether any billboards work, and then also specifically like why religious billboards seem to have become such a phenomenon. So first of all, I just talked to some billboard experts and discovered that actually billboards and out-of-home advertising, which also includes like those ads on the side of buses as they drive by and all that kind of stuff, is actually like pretty popular and seemingly pretty effective, at least if your goal is sort of getting your name out there, because people do go out of their houses and they don't need to be watching the right TV channel or whatever. They're just gonna have to pass you by at some point. And there's an art to making them. You want them to pop and to be short enough to understand, which definitely a lot of billboards aren't. But if you can nail the format, they're really good for getting name recognition out. But the thing that I began to realize as I was reporting is that they're not necessarily great at doing much past that. As long as the thing that they're advertising isn't something that you can take an immediate action on. Like, obviously, if it's an ad for a Cracker Barrel and you're hungry, you might immediately pull off to the advertised Cracker Barrel. So those ones have like a real direct cause and effect. But the religious billboards, it's pretty hard to figure out what to do next, where to funnel the viewers, what to do about engaging them in some way. But they continue to proliferate seemingly for religious causes, in part just because they are really pretty cheap as far as advertising goes. So they're just an accessible way in for groups to try and get the word out. And I think that that's part of what appeals to the Jewish groups and part of what appeals to the Christian groups as well.
You've written two really interesting stories. One was a while back on this group, Jew Belong, who has a series of billboards that are, a lot of them are about anti-Zionism being anti-Semitic. Some of them are about Jewish identity more broadly. And then more recently, you wrote this story about the billboards urging people to either become Christian or engage on a particular Christian issue. Why do you think there's so much renewed interest in specifically billboards among these companies that presumably also could be targeting people through social media or more direct forms of advertisements?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think social media targeting is just much harder. Like, you need a staff, you need to understand analytics, you need to do data research to figure out who your audience is. And it's pretty hard to get your ads to the right audience on something like social media or targeted ads, and it just costs a lot more money to do. It requires a team, it requires more research. And when I was talking to this Christian advertising executive who runs a lot of religious advertising campaigns through his PR communications firm, he was saying that they spend months pulling together just reams and reams of data before they ever start any sort of advertising campaign. It's really expensive, takes a long time, takes a lot of expertise. And it seems like for groups like Jew Belong, and also for this Christian group that has put up these really ubiquitous billboards, which is called Christian Aid Ministries, they seem to just sort of be swinging for the fences by themselves. Like, there's no big like team of researchers behind it. And so I think a big part of it is that it's just an easy way in, and they don't have to necessarily answer to anyone or to any set of data about what is or isn't working. And they can just really get the message that they feel like should work or feels like what they want to say out there without having to prove to some greater authority that it's actually really effective in shifting opinions or is like really the sort of thing that will speak to their target audience.
So, we talk about Christian billboards just to dive in a little more into the details. So, is it like, what specifically is it? Is it Bible verses? Is it, are you sad? Call Jesus? Like, what are some of the specific messages?
It's more the latter. There's a bunch of different ones. The one that I drive by most just says genuine Christians forgive like Jesus, and then in like really small text at the bottom, which like I would never see while driving, but I caught because I like took a photo of it out the window and zoomed in. There's like a little citation to, I think, the book of Luke, but that might be a different one. But they're not generally actually excerpts, at least the ones that I've been seeing. There's, to be clear, the organization that puts up most of the Christian billboards that I see around and that has thousands across the country, I think is the most ubiquitous, but like you might have plenty of local Christian groups in your area putting up their own that look totally different. There's all kinds all over the place. But they tend to have big slogans that range from sort of like vague or even welcoming, like Jesus has the answers to your problems, to like really kind of doom and gloom, hellfire and brimstone, like threatening, which is the ones that say like, are you ready to meet God? Or like, where are you going? Heaven in like a cloudy blue font, or hell in like a fiery font.
So you're saying they need better designers.
Well, they do say on their website, at least, that is their most, the billboard that brings in the most calls, though I don't know if those calls are actually, people who are just trying to like screw with them or complain, or whether they're people who are actually calling because they've been deeply moved in their faith. And I think like one of the things that I really noticed between both the Jewish and the Christian billboards, which I think ties into this fact that they don't have to necessarily do a ton of market research to put up a billboard, is that most of these slogans feel like they only speak to people who are already on board. Like, you know, if I see a billboard that says genuine Christians forgive like Jesus, like, I'm not a Christian. I don't
Right.
believe in Jesus. Like, that means absolutely nothing to me, except perhaps that if I'm in a fight with a Christian, I should tell them to be more like Jesus or something. You know, it just doesn't do a lot for me. And I think similarly, a lot of these anti-Semitism billboards, especially the ones that say are trying to educate, that are less about anti-Zionism and are more about trying to educate anti-Semites about common stereotypes about Jews or counter Holocaust denial or something, they tend to be really quippy to try and catch attention and evoke an emotional response. But to anybody who doesn't already have a fair amount of Holocaust education or already know the stereotypes about Jews that they're referencing, they don't really have space or time to provide a lot of information.
Right.
And I don't think that they'd be very understandable for somebody who doesn't already know the major problems facing Jews today.
You know, growing up in the buckle of the Bible Belt in Southwest Missouri, a lot of these sort of billboards that I saw growing up were, you know, abortion was a big button topic. So it was images of like fetuses and babies, or the more like graphic "you're going to hell if you don't repent" type of things. And it seems like from your stories, a lot of the messaging has gotten a bit more like amorphous. Or, I mean, you mentioned one of the Jewish ones. I wasn't even sure like what exactly it meant. And I'm deeply engaged in Jewish issues. Do you think the messaging has evolved significantly in recent years? And why do you think that is?
I think that that is just like perhaps a question of doing a little bit of targeting. Like the Jewish billboards tend to be in like pretty Jewish areas, which one could argue. And when I spoke to this evangelical advertising person, he was like, I don't really understand why you would put anti-Semitism there, because we know that like the biggest amount of anti-Semites or just people who don't know anything about Jews are not in New York City. They're like in areas of the country that have never met Jews. And so like, you know, you shouldn't be concentrating your efforts in New York so much as you should be concentrating them in sort of these white supremacist strongholds across the country. But I think that some of that is targeting. Like I know from just looking on Twitter and stuff that the abortion billboards or anti-abortion billboards are all over still in sort of Bible Belty places and in Florida and stuff like that. But because the corridor that I drive is between the two liberal cities of New York and Boston through this still relatively liberal corridor of Connecticut, like they know better than to put like super big abortion things. There are some that read like sort of veiled abortion things that say something about, you know, like love children like Jesus does, with just a picture of a really angelic, chubby cheeked baby. But it's not saying legitimately or like literally, if you have an abortion, you're killing this cute baby. It's just like, look at this cute baby. Jesus loves babies, and you're supposed to make the
Right.
inferences yourself. But the stronger toned ones do exist in areas where that is more likely to get a response, at least based on vibes.
You talked about this. You wrote around in January or February around the Super Bowl. You were talking about how there was some Christian advertising, and it was also very kind of amorphous, ambiguous. Be kind to your
Right.
neighbor, you know, messaging. So these billboards that you wrote about, you know, they're all like, you know, call us, call us as a hotline number. You know, if you want to find Jesus, call us. And so you actually did call one of these hotline numbers. So tell us what happened when you called.
Yeah. Well, first I got like a sort of maze of you know, press two to listen to blah 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 sort of phone menu. And it presented a bunch of pre-recorded sermons that were each keyed to specific billboards that I might have walked by. So you know, press two for genuine Christians forgive like Jesus, press three for where am I going, heaven or hell. And you could hear a little sermon, most of which seemed to heavily center on the book of John. And then I eventually navigated through to speak to a live person who was an older man who lives in Kansas. He said that he is one of a team of not all that many, like 30 volunteers, which is a lot fewer than the like 1,300 billboards that there are for this organization. But he was very personable, but much like the slogans, it just seemed like we did not understand how to talk to each other. I told him I was Jewish, and he was immediately sort of like, oh, yeah, and I sort of said something about seeing the Forgiving Christians billboard and told him, I've had some weird kind of conversion-y experiences that I didn't really appreciate. Like when I was in college and my violin teacher took an entire lesson to tell me about Jesus's resurrection because it was Good Friday. And he sort of hemmed and hawed, but then tried to sort of transition over and be like, is your Jewishness or your Judaism really serving you religiously? And obviously I tried to dive into a whole like, well, Judaism is also really cultural, and like it's, there's a lot of ways to relate to these texts and these beliefs and blah, 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 which just did not really, I
He was
think,
testing out the waters.
make any sense to, well, he did legitimately, I think he had heard of the concept of cultural Judaism. So he was like, is your Judaism more cultural or is it spiritually serving you? And I tried to sort of explain that I didn't feel like there was necessarily an either or divide within Judaism about that sort of thing. And he sort of seemed to take from that it was not spiritually serving me, and, cited some of his beliefs, all of which were sort of gleaned from gospel verses, and was telling me, can understand from the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Luke that, God wants this or that from you. And the whole time I was just sort of like, but I don't care about the Gospel of John or Luke. Like that does not automatically connote truth to me. So saying we know that God wants this because it says so in the New Testament, to me, I'm like, the New Testament's not part of my tradition. Just because it says it there is like, for me, like it says it in Moby Dick. It's like a great work that is widely read and has influence on culture, but it doesn't mean that it carries truth value. And so we just had like a sort of strange meandering conversation. And he like recommended a TED Talk to me about how to like find, actualization through my relationships, which he promised was a totally secular TED Talk, but would reveal to me God's plan for how we're supposed to relate to our lives. And we bid each other goodbye.
Well, did you watch the TED Talk?
I did not. It sat in a tab open on my computer for like a month, but I never got around to it. It felt like the sort of self-helpy thing that I was pretty sure I understood what it was going to talk about before I watched it. So then I didn't. My bad.
So there are a lot of very serious contenders in the Jewish space investing in these billboards very heavily, including primarily in heavily Jewish areas like New York City, Los Angeles, and places like that. What, from speaking to these folks, are they trying to accomplish, and how successfully are they doing so?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are not clear what they're trying to accomplish. I think that the overarching goal is really easy to say, we're trying to fight anti-Semitism, but like what kinds or amongst what groups or what does that look like or how will we tell if we've done it seems to just be pretty up in the air. And like I was saying earlier, it feels like a lot of these campaigns are just sort of going on vibes more than on any sort of measurable data or clearly demarcated goals beyond stopping anti-Semitism, which of course is great, but is just a huge topic. And you have, as you mentioned, like Jubelong seems to have really pointed its attention at stopping anti-Zionism, arguably more amongst fellow Jews or just amongst progressives than necessarily amongst like white supremacists or anything like that, or really focusing even on any other forms of anti-Semitism that are maybe more prevalent, that are, about cabals controlling the world or other conspiracy theories. And like, it seems like they've chosen that because that's just what their founder is most passionate about, and that they're making these billboards just based on like her vibes about what she wants to do and not necessarily about, what will have the biggest impact on the widest range of people. I think like when I talked to this Jewish advertising executive who has now moved into teaching about advertising, but worked on a bunch of Jewish campaigns through like the 80s and the 90s, he was saying that this is what he experienced on the inside, that he'd come from like big corporate advertising world, Coca-Cola, Apple, whatever, and he would try and sit down and be like, what are you trying to accomplish? And they would say like shifting the public opinion, which is like almost impossible to measure. Not that
Right.
that's not a good goal, but he was like, can you give me something specific, or like how we'll decide whether this was a good one and we should continue in this direction or try something new next time. And they would just be like, you'll feel it if it's working or not. And that seems to be, at least for a lot of them, sort of how they're made. And they seem to have similarly open-ended goals. Like the LA Jewish Federation's billboards were also just these like not even Jewish phrases about, tolerance and loving your neighbor like yourself, or the golden rule, or, things like that. And that's just a really big open-ended, sort of public service campaign. Like, to make people nice is a pretty vague and difficult goal.
Right. It's hard if you're not selling, if you're selling a product, you'd be like, oh, we put this billboard in this city and we sold X number of products. And, it's hard. Like you said, it's hard to measure. So this is all very fascinating stuff. Now I'm curious to know if you can give us any sneak peek or tease of what you're looking into now, what you're working on next. That our readers can look forward to.
I did just start poking into, I guess, a maybe tangentially related topic, very loosely, which is the politicization of the term and idea of tikkun olam, which seems to have become, amongst certain more right-wing groups within the Jewish sphere, like a interchangeable term with woke, used in the derogatory sense. Whereas for a lot of leftist Jews, it is like a big source of their connection to Judaism and to Jewish identity. So trying to figure out how such a sort of also vague and gentle idea of making the world better has become quite such a political hot button within the Jewish world.
Yeah. If I can just put a plug, Mira does a lot of interfaith reporting, and one of my favorite pieces that we'll put a link in the show notes is this story I think you did last year where you traveled to Utah for a Mormon production of Fiddler on the Roof. So people can check that out in the show notes.
Thank you, Mira.
Thanks.
All right. We'll see you in the office Slack. Take care, Mira.
Bye.
She always writes, it's always like counterintuitive whenever you see a Mira story come up. It's not, it's always like she zags when everyone else is zig. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Love them.
All right. So it's now that reaching the end of the episode of our show. And at the end, we like to offer up our recommendations for the week. Laura, what is your recommendation?
Well, I'm a big sucker for both comedy and documentaries when I'm watching things and when I'm reading things as well. And I just started the Hulu series, The Secrets of Hillsong, about the mega church brand that was also, I think, a Christian band. It's a cautionary tale about the cult of personality and getting swept up in the hype, and how even in religious spaces you need to be pretty cautious against brands built around a cult of personality. It's very interesting. I also like that there's a lot of reporters who broke the stories about Hillsong and their leaders who are interviewed throughout. So if you're into stories about religion and cults and things like that, I think it's very interesting. And Zarnagarg's special, I found it. It's called 1 in a Billion on Amazon. So you should definitely watch Zarna's special as well.
I was going to say, you said you like comedy and documentaries. The Secrets of Hillsong, that's not a comedy though, is it?
They were separate categories.
Oh, okay.
I like documentaries that explore and unearth different things, either within religious spaces or within, beloved brands, things like that.
Zarna may be a good guest for a future episode.
Yeah.
So my recommendation for the week, no surprise, it's Einstein related because I'm obsessed with Einstein. But I just finished a pretty amazing book that I didn't know that much about. A chapter in history was it's called Einstein's War. Einstein's War by Dr. Matthew Stanley. He's a professor of history at NYU. And it's really all about when Einstein came up with his theory of relativity. It was during World War One, and everybody hated Germany during World War One, and so all of these anti-relativity, anti-Einstein groups formed, and they were passing out pamphlets saying how crazy Einstein was, and nobody wanted to listen to him or believe him. And often those pamphlets were laced with anti-Semitism. And then obviously in World War II, in lead up to World War II, the Germans wanted to take credit. The Nazis wanted to take credit for the theory of relativity, and so they said that Einstein stole it from non-Jewish scientists. So it's a fascinating book. I didn't realize, I just assumed Einstein's a genius and everyone knows he's a genius, but apparently there was this whole war going on, trying to a disinformation campaign, if you will, in the modern parlance. So it was a pretty interesting chapter. That's my recommendation.
Yeah, it sounds interesting. I mean, I do know that Einstein built off of theories that, other German scientists had developed, but it sounds interesting. I mean, the ownership of ideas is like a fascinating thing.
Yeah.
It sounds interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is our show for this week. Hope everybody has a great weekend, and we will be back here next week. Take care.
Enjoy your air conditioning, Benyamin.
Thanks.